Assalamu alaikum. So I'm going to begin. I've been given a mandate by the organizers, and thank you very much for having me come speak today, to talk about the civil rights challenges, where they come from, what I think some of the main issues are going to be, and some lessons learned and what we might be doing to prepare. And I am to exercise that mandate inshallah, over a period of 15 to 20 minutes. And what I'm going to try and do is keep it a little bit shorter, because I think one of the things that happens in these discussions is that the Q&A is where some of the richness comes in. And I'd like to be able to reserve time for that. And I know my esteemed colleague Khalil also wants to do that. So let me begin this talk by talking about something that is often unusual in this particular area of work, which is a success. And that success came last week when the Obama administration dismantled the regulatory framework for the NSEERS program. I think you probably all know what that is, the National Security Entry-Exit Registration Program. It's commonly was being talked about as the Muslim Registry. And even though this was a program that the Obama administration officially sort of put an end to back in 2011, the regulatory framework continued. And many of you will recall that this was a program that essentially targeted men from majority Muslim countries, 24 majority Muslim countries and North Korea, for registration. It tore apart families, communities, businesses. About 16,000 men were deported. People were unjustly interrogated. People were abused. And the framework had still been left in place. Now, the dismantlement would not have happened, I think, without work being done first and foremost by grassroots organizations. Groups working with impacted communities at the local and state levels with the support of national organizations like the ACLU, as well as former government officials. Now, I am not naive, having done this work for a long time now. I think what this essentially does is it buys us all some time. I think it makes it harder to reinstigate the program, but I don't think anyone should be naive and think that a Trump administration might not seek to come in and reinstate that program. As all of us are planning and anticipating for what lies ahead, I think it's fair to say that we expect that if the Trump administration's campaign promises become reality, we have a fight before us, all of us, that will define the lives and liberty of our generation, probably generations to come. And we should not underestimate what that fight is. It is at the same time a fight that we have already been engaged in, a fight against racial and religious bigotry, against federal programs, discrimination in the workplace, discrimination and bullying in schools, and political rhetoric that casts Muslim religious identity as suspect and potentially criminal, if not worse. Now, when we're thinking about what's ahead, I think it's also important to be very clear-eyed about where this fight has been. And the reality is that the threat in the next administration comes not just from extreme programs that might be put in place and that campaign advisors and people who are now being nominated for positions in the administration seem to have advocated in the past, but the threat actually also comes from policies and programs that were put in place during the Bush administration, which the Obama administration either left in place or expanded. And I think we know what most of those are, but I think I want to sort of lay out for you some of what our main concerns are at the ACLU as we look to what lies ahead. One of them is the Justice Department's guidance on race, which was reissued in 2014. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know, but once upon a time, before 9/11, in fact, the summer of 2001, Congress was poised to pass legislation called the End Racial Profiling Act. it would have barred profiling based on religion, national origin, ethnicity, as any kind of basis for suspicion or investigation. And of course, that didn't happen, but what happened was something even worse, which is that over a period of time, the Justice Department issued guidance that recognized that bias-based profiling is unlawful, unconstitutional, ineffective, and then carved out loopholes for bias-based profiling in the national security and border contexts. So in 2014, after years of effort on the part of civil rights groups, human rights groups, groups representing minority organizations, advocacy with an African American Attorney General under an African American president, groups said, please expand the guidance on race to ban profiling based on national origin, ethnicity, and religion, and take out the loopholes. And we got something good, which is that racial profiling on the basis of national origin and religion is now banned, but they still left in place the loopholes for national security and border integrity and border investigations under pressure from the FBI. And that still remains in place. And that explains why it is that discriminatory practices may continue and are continuing in investigations that we come across. Relatedly, another authority that we should all look out for and know about if you don't already, which is the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Operations Guide. Post 9/11, the FBI claimed the authority under its Domestic Investigations Operations Guide to conduct surveillance and investigations, including by using informants and other very intrusive and divisive techniques, without any factual basis to suspect actual wrongdoing. So in plain English, they don't have to have a basis to suspect you've done anything wrong in order to conduct this kind of surveillance and investigation. Now, when you combine that claimed authority by the FBI with the loopholes in the guidance on race, you can see why some of the things that these communities, our communities, have been experiencing for so long continue. Another thing that we're concerned about is the massive and growing watch listing system, right? That thing that causes 4 S's to be put on boarding passes and subjects people to additional scrutiny. The watch listing system, which discriminatorily is targeting Muslims, people who appear to be Muslim on the basis of association and belief, for placement on the no-fly list. A system that denies still a fair process for people to challenge their inclusion on that list. Now, I've been litigating a lawsuit seeking a fair process on the no-fly list. We've been doing it since 2010. The government has fought us every step of the way. One success that we had as a result of this lawsuit is that they had to change their policies. For the first time, if you're barred from flying, you go through a redress process and they have to tell you whether you're on the no-fly list or not. But the process that they then put in place in order to challenge it, which allows for the provision of some information, is still unconstitutional. And so we're challenging it again. But here's another thing that the lawsuit revealed, which is in the filings, the government admitted that it is essentially putting people on the no-fly list and other watch lists based on predictions that people who've never actually even been charged with a crime might nevertheless commit some crime in the future, right? Think about how wrong that is under our system of values and justice. And you're put in an impossible situation of trying to prove yourself innocent of something you haven't done and will never do. And that's partly why it's so important to have a fair redress process, and that's one of the things that I think the watch listing system is probably going to expand. The fight for a fair process is also going to have to continue to expand. Another area which I think is deeply problematic is the system for designating groups and individuals as terrorist entities or terrorist organizations, right? I probably don't need to remind you, but in the years after 9/11, the Bush administration went after this country's largest Muslim charities on the basis of suspicion, shut many of them down, and an entire part of Muslim civil society was decimated, spreading fear, chill, impacting the ability to provide zakat, right? Now, the Obama administration left in place a process that courts have found unconstitutional. They found it unconstitutional in a case called Kind Hearts, which is a case that I know intimately because I litigated that case, and also in a case called Al-Haramain. So it's very important for us all to know that when the government seeks to shut down Muslim civil society or organizations or charities on the basis of suspicion, courts have said that that is a violation of the Fourth Amendment right against seizure without a warrant and probable cause, and it's a violation of the Fifth Amendment right to due process. But the regulations still remain the same and are still in place, so that's another thing to look out for, especially as there are news reports about the next administrations, at least certain people within the administration, seeking to designate the global Muslim Brotherhood, whatever that is, or an arm of it as a foreign terrorist organization, which the fear is could be used then to go after Muslim civil society on the basis of material support or other kinds of designation. At the individual level, many other abuses continue. Voluntary interviews, for example, or the push for so-called countering violent extremism programs that are in essence programs that put the security lens on Muslim communities, identify them as suspect, stigmatize them, and essentially place a burden on them on having to monitor and police their own. One document that I found particularly problematic in the last year was guidance that the FBI sent out to high schools around the country that essentially asked schools to monitor kids for signs of extremism. Recently, there have been reports that the focus of CVE programs, which over time has changed so that at least the language used is that it's about extremism in general as opposed to Muslims in particular, even though the reality is it's about Muslims in particular, that the Trump administration might seek to do away with even that generalizing language and really focus on targeting Muslims. The list is long, right? We've seen in past years, legislation to counteract problems that don't exist. The notion that Sharia law is going to be imposed in this country by people who don't necessarily understand what Sharia even is. Any number of things we might see coming and should anticipate. So if the list is long, what are some of the things that we can do to prepare and counteract and challenge? Well, before I get into that specifically, I've been thinking a lot about this. I woke up the morning after the election starting to make lists of everything that needed to be done, given our analysis of what the Trump campaign proposals had been and how unconstitutional they were. And I realized when I got to work and I was like, here's our list, let's start. And people were like, they needed to mourn. They needed to sort of mark the fear that was in our hallways as well, and the sadness. And then we needed to get down to work. And among the things that I've been hearing since, which I want to sort of answer, is if religious freedom is guaranteed, if the Constitution says that the government cannot interfere with religion, if the government cannot come in and say, this is a good strain of Islam, this is a bad strain of Islam, or say, this is a good Muslim or this is a bad Muslim, if equal protection is guaranteed, then why is it that they can still be thinking about these proposals, and why can these programs still be put in place? And then the other thing that I've been hearing a lot about is we've worked so hard since 9/11 on these sets of issues. Is that all going to be wiped out? Where has all that work gone? And so a couple of answers there on that, which is the Constitution in this country is a living document. Because the words exist on paper and in laws doesn't necessarily mean that the government is going to give them the meaning that is the right meaning, right? And if history in this country and in virtually any other country shows us, it's that the struggle for civil rights is a long one, right? Brown versus Board of Education, decades-old decision that found segregation in schools unconstitutional. Well, form of segregation in school continues around the country. That de facto segregation continues, and it still is being fought. Voting rights, guaranteed, one person, one vote, under attack all over again, needs to be defended. And so this struggle will continue, and we should expect it to continue not just for the next 4 years, although I think it will be at a potentially much higher pitch in the next 4 years, but for a longer term. And how do we think about what that means? The government will likely claim that it is not targeting Muslims specifically, because I think that when the administration comes into office, it will recognize that there are restraints on making those kinds of claims. They might claim that they're targeting Muslims specifically. That'll make all of our jobs much easier in terms of challenges in the court, quite frankly. But what the usual pattern has been is, it's not about religion, it's about crime, or about national security, or about something else. This was the argument that the NYPD made in its Muslim surveillance program when we sued them for it, which is, we weren't targeting Muslims, we were actually just doing this for security reasons. Well, they've now agreed that to put in place some safeguards and reforms, more of which will be needed, but in essence it will be claims likely that will be based on the need to secure our borders, the need to guard against terrorism, even as the threat of terrorism is inflated beyond what is actually real. And the fight will continue such that we have to keep reminding people in the public of the things that we have been able to secure, right? After 246 individuals and organizations were listed as unindicted co-conspirators in the Holy Land Foundation case, smearing and stigmatizing some of our country's organizations and individuals, we secured a victory for ISNA and NATE, and CARE had one too, where the court found that inclusion on the unindicted co-conspirators list was a violation of the Fifth Amendment. One lesson to take from that is courts are important. They are critically important. And right since after the election, the ACLU has been saying, and our colleague organizations have been saying, if these programs are put in place, we will sue, right? And we will fight, and we will slow things down, and we will stop them, and we will challenge. But make no mistake, and this is, I think, one of the first lessons that I've learned and want to share, which is that lawsuits are never the only answer. They are one tool, and they have to be part of a broader tool. And we need many tools for our long-term struggle. So among the things that our lessons learned are organizing for civil rights and social justice at the grassroots level. There have been so many advances and improvements in our communities with organizations developing the capacity to do that and enhancing the capacity to do that, and we have to build more on that. But we also have to do it outside of our communities. We have to be allies, and we have to be allies with other groups that are also under attack. I will never forget one of the early lessons I learned in doing this work, which is knowing that the FBI was engaged in mapping of Muslim communities and other communities around the country and trying to think about how to make that stop. And I called the Shura Council of Los Angeles because they had been successful in preventing the LAPD from implementing a mapping program in LA. And I asked them, what are the lessons I can learn? You know, what are the lessons we can all learn? And one of the sheikhs on the Shura Council said, you know, we've spent decades here building alliances with other communities. So when the phone call came that this LAPD program was being put in place, I got calls from traditional civil rights communities, from the Latino American community, from LGBT communities who said, tell us what you need and we will be on the steps of City Hall with you. But that only came about because communities in LA had been there for other communities, for each other. And that, to me, was one of the most important lessons to learn in this particular era. The other aspects that I think we need to focus on even more is education, right? Dissemination of Know Your Rights materials. Multiple organizations have excellent materials. In the last year, we decided, in response to needs from communities at the ACLU, that we were going to produce a set of materials on anti-Muslim discrimination at the border, in schools, at the airports, with regard to questioning, with regard to what you can bring in and out. Let's disseminate these. Let's make sure that every person knows that they should not talk to law enforcement, the FBI, local police, without a lawyer. We all think, all of us, I have nothing to hide, I'm done nothing wrong. I wish we lived in a world where that was enough. We don't. And so, in an era of informants, pressure to become informants, the use of immigration as a pressure vehicle, it is imperative that we have lawyers when we're talking to law enforcement. Due diligence. Due diligence, I think, many communities, masajid, civil society organizations, charities learned that lesson post 9/11 with respect to record keeping, accounting, legal frameworks. We've got to double down and make sure if you need to get a lawyer to review your work or an accountant to review it, do it. There's nothing wrong with it. It can provide you with security, it can provide you with guidance. The final thing I'll leave you with is one that I've become increasingly sort of frustrated about, which is one of the areas I work on is privacy and surveillance. And so much of the debate on surveillance and NSA surveillance and so on takes place at a level of Washington, D.C. and organizations devoted to privacy rights. It's not happening within communities, or not happening enough within the communities that are most likely to be impacted and who are most likely to be targeted by NSA surveillance, FBI surveillance, and other kinds of surveillance. And so one of the things that I think we should all do is learn about securing our communications. Encryption, text messages, WhatsApp. Use the more secure means available, not because you're doing anything wrong, you're not, but because you're doing the right thing, which is to asserting your rights and doing it in the best way possible so that you are able to maintain a right to privacy, which is one of the things guaranteed under this Constitution, a right to protest, a right to dissent, a right to exercise every single one of those other constitutional rights, and doing it in such a way that we are all, inshallah, better prepared for what is about to come. Thank you. Great. Thank you for these questions. First one is aimed at me, and the question is, you said lawsuits aren't enough. What else can we do to help? There's also a good second question that comes after that. I'll just read that as well, which is, what are the effects of a Republican House, Republican Senate, and an open spot on the Supreme Court on this simplicity of Trump making legislation like NCRs? So when I said a lawsuit is not enough, the other things that we can do are really to recognize that a lawsuit is part of a tool that is part of strategic means to achieve change, right? And so let me give one example of what that looks like, which is based out of my experience in New York City with the Muslim surveillance program and the NYPD, right? So it took us, colleagues and I, 2 years to work with local communities, go to masajids nights and weekends, which is when people are available, because people are working, right? Everyone to sort of to say, what are the facts, right? What can help us? Who are the people who will get past the thresholds that the courts have erected as hurdles for civil rights litigation, right? What are the facts that can show not only that this happened, but that it had an impact that is a negative impact, which are some of the things that you need to do to show constitutional violations. When we filed that lawsuit, that also included work done by communities coming together that put pressure on the Bloomberg administration and then the de Blasio administration, right? politicians are motivated by the need to get elected or the need to not be unpopular. And in essence, there was work done by communities on the ground to show that American Muslim communities in New York, in all of their diversity, communities in their diversity stood behind this lawsuit. That there were people who came out from Jewish communities, from Sikh communities, from, non-minority communities who said what is happening is wrong, so that this is, yes, a Muslim issue, but it's an issue that impacts all of us because it's a Muslim issue. You're discriminating against my neighbor. And that's the kind of thing that we needed in order to achieve long-term change. New York is by no means perfect, right? All got our, various different issues amongst communities and within communities. But part of what was done there was a movement that coalesced around the lawsuit, but also was separate from the lawsuit in terms of legislative reform, in terms of oversight by an inspector general, in terms of community organizing and capacity building to do education, to build up resilience against what might be pressure on people to become informants within communities or within mosques, educating people about how that might be addressed. So a lawsuit is part of a larger social organizing tool, and that tool relies on grassroots involvement. It relies on community resilience, strength, and demonstrated political organizing and capacity. The effects of a Republican House, Senate, and so on legislation like NSEER. So first of all, what will have to happen is that I think it would be very hard for Trump to put anything in place, for the Trump administration to put anything in place like NSEERs without going through regulatory framework, right? Which will require, can't be done by an executive order. They could try, but I don't think they'd be able to do that, which would require them to go through a notice and comment period, which is necessary for regulation, right? All of these things are then mobilizing tools, which is an opportunity for there to be notice and comment that essentially says why this is unnecessary from a civil rights perspective, from an equality perspective, why it's unfair from a security perspective, and all of those things, so that at each step in the process there are barriers built. And then if they still go ahead, right, lawsuits usually come only after programs have been implemented, either on their face or in their impact. If it then still goes ahead, that's also evidence that gets put forward before a court, right? I think we are again in tough times with a Republican-controlled Congress, with people who have an impetus to support what might be some very extreme proposals being put forward by the Trump administration. But we still have to do that work with that Congress. We still have to get out the voices that are in addition to our voices, right, from communities and from the rights-based perspective, voices that Republicans have to listen to as well. The security voices, the voices that come from the FBI that say, we actually don't think that this is a right idea. And if we then get up to the court, we still have that chance. If we lose years down the line, which I don't think we would on something like this, then there is still further advocating, legislating, reforms, breakdowns, because again, NSEERs was challenged and then it was dismantled. Things come in waves, they could happen, and they again. The final question is, what would you recommend as the ways to address fringe elements in the Masajid community, which I'm not sure I understand, so whoever else that come up and talk to me afterwards so I can best understand what that is. And then related to that is, how should possible informants be addressed? So let me address that one. The issue of informants is a very delicate one, because I think one of the things to recognize is that part of what happens with the use of informants, we saw this in Masajid over and over again in New York, is people can sometimes wrongly be suspected of being informants, right? So you've got to keep that in mind as well, and recognize that there are security consequences of accusing another member of the community of becoming an informant. False accusations can be just as harmful, right? So, and then also recognize that people become pressured to become informants for things that we may not know or recognize, and that can also be dangerous, right? I know stories of people who are pressured to become informants as a threat or promise of resolving an immigration status or issue, or as a plea or something along those lines. So my advice in these situations always is be very, very careful. Try not to spread suspicions within communities because that can become very poisonous to communities. Talk to your imam and then talk to a lawyer about how best to help you. Build on what Khalil was saying, there are excellent organizations around the country. There is CARE, there is MLFA, there are ACLU chapters. There are multiple organizations that can help guide you through some of the sensitivities and issues around this particular area, but it would be very important not to take suspicion into your own hands in such a way that could be a threat to you or the person that you suspect as well.